Hi, my name is Jennifer Rowden with Rockingham Planning Commission, and I'm here to present the Town of East Kingston Housing Needs Assessment and Land Use Regulatory Audit. This work was done as part of a grant received by the Town of East Kingston in early 2023 to conduct housing work through the Invest New Hampshire program that was aimed through the state funding as to help the communities to look at their planning and zoning documents and their own regulations to be able to identify where there may be opportunities within the municipality to increase housing diversity, and the goal of helping to alleviate some of the housing issues that are currently being experienced by the state. All of these documents are available on the town website, and this recording was also conducted as part of a presentation to the East Kingston Planning Board that was presented on June 20th, 2024, and was open to the public. The first goal of this project was actually to conduct some outreach and to evaluate the town of East Kingston's housing needs based on both recent demographic data and housing data through the census and other regional housing documents, but also to look at the town of East Kingston's master plan chapters and identify what goals the town has set with their land use and housing in the past to see how that may be meeting the existing needs of the community. This was also presented in this document to review some of the state laws that actually impact what municipalities are required to do or to meet in order to be in compliant with those state laws. We do offer an overview as to what the major housing challenges are that are occurring not only in East Kingston, but all other communities in southern New Hampshire as a whole, and within the country. They're basically come down to four main identified goals or challenges that are really being experienced. One is a general lack of available housing of all types across East Kingston and New Hampshire, which is common for all rural communities. Then determining how to really balance the housing needs within the community while protecting the natural resources and the open spaces that East Kingston currently enjoys. There are certainly concerns about the feasibility and the availability of infrastructure that can be both water infrastructure, wastewater, septic infrastructure, or just roads and the ability of the land to support any additional housing. And then the overall goal of keeping the community character that residents really enjoy while considering future development. While things are always going to change, guiding that future development is something that East Kingston has put a lot of pride and effort into, and wanting to make sure that they are maintaining the things that are the reasons that people really love East Kingston. The two main factors, and this is the document that we're reviewing right now that we looked at as part of this Invest New Hampshire housing work, was to develop a housing needs assessment. The goal was really to evaluate the latest data to assist the East Kingston Planning Board to better understand what the public had to say about housing, what the goals and vision of the existing master plan might be, and how that might align with the existing housing data, projected housing needs, and those needs of the overall region beyond just East Kingston. The second part of the project was to develop a land use audit. This was evaluating possible changes to land use regulations that East Kingston could consider taking to help increase housing opportunity, but also to identify the pros and cons of different land use regulation tools and potential changes in future master plan updates. Neither of these documents are required to be adopted by the community. However, they are intended to be informational guides as East Kingston and the Planning Board move forward with potential changes to regulations to take into consideration. While East Kingston does not, and especially the Planning Board does not actually build development, they do put forth regulation changes to the voters that can expand the opportunities for housing development. Part of the document does evaluate that the current East Kingston master plan, which really does identify that East Kingston wishes to keep its existing housing really focused on preserving that rural and farming character, but also wants to enhance the look and feel of the town. It wants to preserve natural resources while also limiting the cost of the town as far as infrastructure investments and services. These include things like paving of roads, school expansions, or expansions of the needs of the fire and police departments. So, an overview of some of the housing data for East Kingston. East Kingston's housing stock has really not increased by a lot since the last census in the last 20 years. So there were 32 new housing units that were built between 2010 and 2020 for a total of 943 housing units. That can be single family homes, that can be apartments. That does not actually capture the accessory dwellings, of which East Kingston does have some. One notable shift in East Kingston is that the community has aged quite a bit, with the average age in 2020 of being 52.8 years old. That is relatively similar to the experience of the overall state, which the majority of the population in New Hampshire is growing older. With this, East Kingston itself, 34% of the population is over 65. That's contrasted by the only 15.6% of the population being under 18. That really just has impact as to the types of housing that might be desired or required, pitted against the existing housing stock. Like most rural communities in southeastern New Hampshire, East Kingston is largely made up of single family homes that are owner occupied. There is generally a general lack of rental units available, not only in East Kingston, but also in the greater Seacoast region, with only about 15% of the housing stock in East Kingston actually being rental units. East Kingston's housing stock, similar to neighboring communities, is generally older, with about half the homes in the community being over 50 years of age. This comes into play in that the community character is often based on some of those historical characteristics, but it also can mean that sometimes the ability for folks to age in place as they are growing older can be harder simply because of the construction and ability to modify older homes to maintain that accessibility for folks. East Kingston is a really desirable community because of its rural nature. Because of that, the prices of homes, along with neighboring communities, is relatively high, with the median home sales price in 2023 of being a little over $525,000 for a single family home for the greater region. But in East Kingston itself, it's a little over $616,000 from March 2023 through March 2024. Based on the area's median household income, the affordability amount for a single family home in Rockingham County is just over $407,000, with the regional's median household income of just shy of $90,000. As part of our housing needs assessment, we do give an overview of key housing data, which has been discussed in some of my previous comments. One of the aspects that does come into play is that when we are looking at how much housing might East Kingston need in the future, there has been identified that 139 more housing units would be needed by 2024 in order for East Kingston to meet what is known as its regional fair share of housing. What that is a percentage of housing in the region that would be needed to accommodate both the growth in population and also the growth in the number of housing units that are needed. Of those 139 housing units that would be needed by 2024, it's been identified that 63 of those housing units would need to meet affordability thresholds, which is generally defined as someone not spending more than 30% of their income on their housing, which could be their mortgage, their property insurance, and their local land use taxes, or for renters, it would just include their rent and their utilities. Some of the foundational documents and laws that play into housing considerations for municipalities are the Regional Housing Needs Assessment that was developed by Rockingham Planning Commission, my office, in 2023. This provides an overview as to some of the housing challenges and identified needs of the region. The secondary aspect that comes into housing decisions at the local level is the New Hampshire Workforce Housing Law and Fair Share Housing Needs Assessment. The summary of that law is that it requires every municipality in New Hampshire to provide reasonable and realistic opportunities for the development of workforce housing. And what that key word there is opportunities, because municipalities in general do not actually develop or build any housing, but they do enable the rules that allow housing to happen. In the case of the fair share assessment, and the other companion to this law is that municipalities either need to prove that they are providing sufficient proportionate workforce housing and affordable housing, or they have a secondary option of providing a local ordinance called an inclusionary or a workforce housing ordinance that also provides that enabling laws to produce workforce housing. This is something that East Kingston already has on the books, so they are, in fact, as a town, is in compliance with this state law. So it is recommended in our next discussion that that law stay on the books in order to help the town maintain its status in compliance with that law. A number of different outreach components were done as part of this effort, including a community-wide survey. Unfortunately, that survey did not see a strong response rate, so we've included that it was conducted. However, it has been recommended that a next step for any housing discussion really includes some targeted outreach so that more input from the community can be received. A survey was also conducted that was sent to East Kingston staff, officials, and volunteers. The reason for this survey was really to target those folks in the community that really allow the community to function, to understand their housing needs and what they feel are some of the concerns going forward. The major outreach that was received from that survey was that the majority of staff, volunteers, and officials have lived in East Kingston for quite some time, and they are largely able to reside in their own single-family homes. Some of the major concerns that were received from that survey were just the imbalance of the demographics in East Kingston, simply that the high cost of housing may make it difficult for younger people and families to be able to move into town or to stay in town if they grew up in the community, but also the ability for older folks to be able to stay in town because of the housing prices if they find that at some point they need to downsize from their single family homes. General affordability was certainly a concern, along with the contrast of maintaining the rural character. So lots of comments that sort of had two different goals of wanting to retain the things that people love about East Kingston, but also not wanting to exclude others that may want to come in or stay in the community. Within the housing needs assessment, we do give a lot of data within the Appendix A that goes into a lot of detail. We also capture the full survey responses that was done as part of the outreach and the housing survey done to staff and officials. And finally, in the final appendix, we do give a overview of common housing terms, as housing terms are often confused by officials and the public when they are being used casually versus how they may be constructed and used in official capacities or within state law. The secondary companion to this grant effort in the Invest New Hampshire program was the land use regulation audit, which again was aimed at identifying where opportunities may exist for East Kingston to provide changes to its existing regulations to enable more housing opportunity, but also to identify the pros and cons of a variety of land use tools that can spur housing development, but may in some cases not be the best fit for East Kingston and its existing land use, its community goals, its public perception, and also its infrastructure capacity. The two key findings that came out of this land use audit were really to recommend that East Kingston continue to promote consideration of amending regulations that really will expand residential uses in areas that already have a level of development in order to maintain open space and minimize impact on environmental resources, with the acknowledgement that there is generally a lack of any centralized infrastructure within East Kingston, so that feasibility may be limited and further study may be needed to identify the exact locations within town that could support further density. The secondary comment was to maintain the regulations that help to keep East Kingston in compliance with the state workforce housing law, to ensure that those housing options are available, and if possible, development can occur that includes accommodation for workforce housing. The overview of the land use audit includes an overview as to what type of residential uses are currently allowed in different zoning districts within East Kingston. Generally, residential uses are allowed in every district other than the commercial and light industrial zones. We do provide an overview as to the impact of different housing strategies or types of regulations that can be used, along with what could be expected if that strategy or tool were to be used. Is there potential for a lot of housing development or minimal housing development? What are the potential impacts on the community character, be that negative, somewhat neutral, or positive impacts? Has there been documented community support, either that would suggest that that tool is not something that would be acceptable to residents, maybe acceptable in some cases and not in others, or potentially strongly supported by the community? And then finally, how feasible is that tool? Is it going to be difficult for a community to get adopted or to administer? Is it going to require further logistical and costs, such as expanding infrastructure or enabling new programs or new staffing that may be required to implement that tool? So this evaluation goes through in sort of a snapshot format as to what several different strategies can do. For example, here you have accessory dwellings. The housing impact potential of that strategy may be minimal, although it may be highly feasible to be able to implement, simply because accessory dwellings in a variety of different ways are a tool that can be integrated into most communities with minimal impact on infrastructure beyond the lot where it may be proposed. It typically fits in fairly nicely with existing the characteristics of a community, but some of the details would have to be discussed if something were to be implemented or changed in East Kingston. And there has been fairly, in this case, neutral support for accessory dwelling modifications. In 2024 at town meeting, East Kingston did make revisions to its accessory dwelling structures to enable more opportunities for some accessory dwellings, including allowing them to be in detached structures in certain circumstances. The strategies that are reviewed in here will go into a bit more detail in a moment. We do again bring in understanding housing by including a listing of different housing terms and definitions to help with framing the discussion should the planning board consider going forth with some of the recommended strategies in this document. The housing strategies that are evaluated as part of this document include accessory dwellings, adaptive reuse, age-friendly neighborhoods, cluster zoning, form-based codes, workforce housing, infill development, manufactured housing, mixed-use development, planned unit development, a general category of reduced zoning and subdivision requirements, and then we have 2 economic development tools that do have a component of land use regulations, including establishing a tax increment financing or a TIF district, or using a tool called transfer of development rights, which basically encourages development in certain areas of town while leaving other parts of town undeveloped. We'll go through one overview as to what the different strategies look at. Accessory dwellings themselves, the overview is that it provides context as to what they are. Does the community currently allow accessory dwellings, and in what context? Are there components that are positive related to that strategy or use, or negatives? For example, East Kingston currently does allow attached and detached accessory dwellings, while only allowing 1 accessory dwelling per parcel, and that the process in obtaining that is requiring a special exception. We go through potential benefits of each strategy, potential constraints. If a particular strategy is not utilized, what are the opportunity costs? If the community were to consider implementing changes to its accessory dwelling unit or ordinance and implementing it, what really needs to be considered? And then what specifically could East Kingston do in the future going forward? Now, the specific language that may be used as part of an accessory dwelling ordinance or a rewrite would have to be discussed at the planning board level. The intent of this document is to really start that enabling conversation so that everyone can be caught up to speed as to what we're talking about and what the considerations are before getting into the specifics of what a regulation, adoption, or change may be. And with that, we are going to end our presentation, but further work is being considered by the East Kingston Planning Board through a second round of grants that is the same granting source that produced this program, and all that discussion will be captured during planning board meetings at their regularly scheduled meetings, which all agendas are available on the town website. Thank you.